We have a special guest with us today that I get to introduce for this service, and his name is Pastor Jason. And the special thing is, Pastor Jason has been serving with the Evangelical Covenant Church for many years now within the world of church planting. In fact, it was him and his wife Lisa that ran the church planting assessment that Angie and I went to. And so they've been with us from the beginning. When we left Church Planters Assessment, we actually said the phrase to each other, man, I just wish Jason and Lisa were like in our conference so we could church plant, and they're so wise and they're so encouraging. Oh, that'd be awesome. Then about 4 months ago, he shows up in the doorway, and he's now they are in Titusville where they have an RV, and they have been making the drive probably twice a month since they've been here to be with us on Sunday morning to have this be their winter haven, to be a part of this church. And we look forward to that to being for many, many years. So Jason is currently supporting church plants specifically in Canada, but has done church planting on the East Coast, Providence, then New York City multiple times, Boston. I mean, some of the hardest places in the country to do church planting, and he's built leaders and developed churches. And so we're thankful to hear the word he has today. So let's invite Jason to come on up.
Thanks for that. Oh, there. That's a fun intro. So, good to be with you. We're going to find out if the first service was a practice one, and this is going to be the good one, or if I left it all in the field. And it's just what it is. We'll try to make it right down the middle. How about? So, how many have heard this idea? We'll just start off with a question, which is to be Christian, and we'll put it in scare quotes, is to be civilized. You can throw in another synonym there, polite, well-behaved, nice, a good neighbor, a good citizen. Has anyone, whether you grew up in the church or definitely like me, did not, we'll get to that in a moment, have at least had this concept hit you? I see some nods. You don't need to raise hands. No amens on this one, please. But it's an interesting question. And so for myself, and I think Kevin shared some of his testimony, he does often, I'm sure, but I remember last week, the week before, grew up in a Christian family and knew Jesus from an early age. I did not grow up in a Christian family or one that faked it. I was raised by bears in northern Maine. Like that's where I am from. I had loving parents that did their best, but felt like raised by bears. I would say I was raised sort of American heathen. Like that was the category. We had four commandments: don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't get caught, those kind of things. So for me to stand here today, and even what Kevin doesn't make sense unless some other things make more sense. But this is a question that I think is worth addressing. And based on this, or more importantly, who does Jesus call us to be? And who does he call you to be? And I don't mean like you generically, but you and me and you, like literally. And what flows from that is the question, what kind of church might he want? We'll see how the title lines up, if at all, eventually. So we're going to dive into a passage. And before we do that, let me set the stage and give a little context here. Because it may surprise you what this set of scriptures says about these questions and this idea. And so where we're going to find ourselves in a moment is in the Gospel of John. And it's in the earliest part of what we would now call Holy Week, but then it was this massive high holy festival of Passover that the Jewish people and from all around would come together for. And so we're going to find ourselves there, and it's during this final week where the intensity of Jesus and his earthly ministry is about to come to a critical moment that we're going to drop in. What's already happened, so here's the energy that we're kind of jumping in about a third of the way through the week at most, is he's had a triumphal entry, which to tie in slightly to the message series that Kevin's been walking this church community through on end times, is that what, just the fascinating stuff there. There's a fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy, these weeks of years, sevens of years that land us here. But also what's happened is this fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy of this picture of Israel's redeeming king arriving on a donkey instead of the far more believable or likely war horse with an invading army, but has come this way. That's what we're coming into with all this energy and controversy starting to unfold in this week. And so giving that context, whatever then happens next and unfolds, and even more so sort of made the cut to make it into the Gospels, you can be assured is significant. All right? So with that bit of orientation, John chapter 12, verse 20. It says, now among those who went up to worship at the festival were some Greeks. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and said to him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Stop right there. Even if you didn't grow up in church culture, you might like Greeks. Is that unusual? It's a bit of an oxymoron. And it sort of is, though not completely unheard of. There were, and this is probably who this people group is, this group of men, very likely a group of men, that are Greek-speaking Gentiles, possibly converts to Judaism, but more likely, I think, and a lot of scholarly stuff would back this up, that they're God-fearers. That's those Gentiles who are very sympathetic to the Jewish belief system, that way of life. But for whatever reason, it might be their literal occupation, like Roman centurions who served the empire and carried a sword and killed people. They could never be ceremonially clean. Other things they would do, or just I can't enjoy barbecue and there's this circumcision thing. I'm gonna stop short. No, pun intended, I don't know. I don't know this, I don't know what I'm allowed to say here, but the barbarian part's gonna come through probably. But nonetheless, they are curious and cautious in their approach. And even they're a bit proper and polite because they say, sir, and they don't go to Jesus. They actually go to Philip. So what's going on there with Philip? So they approach Philip, who actually has a Greek name, which is somewhat unusual. Most of the disciples had, Semitic, Jewish names, Simon, John, James, but Philip, which is Philippos, means lover of horses. Not something first century Jews were known for their love of horses, but Philip, he kind of comes from an edge of that community. He's also from Bethsaida, which is a region with some Hellenistic influence. That's another way of saying that Greco-Roman culture is at work there. He's in that zone where they'd interact with those Gentile territories. And he also has some habits or some indication in the Gospels that he's a bit of a connector, sort of. He's the one who introduced Nathanael to Jesus, his best friend Nathanael. He makes that connection. But also in some other moments, he freezes up a little bit. He's unsure of what to do with the challenge he sees. We'll get back to that. But in classic fashion, he's got a guy. He may not know what to do, but he's got a guy. And so he goes, not to Jesus yet, to Andrew. And so picking up end of verse 21 again, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. So Philip went and told Andrew. Then Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. So the worshiping Greeks, bit odd, approach Philip, kind of Greek presenting, maybe. I don't know, if the Gentile or the Greek-leaning Jews maybe had mullets or they would dress differently or there's something that they recognize. This is kind of one of our folks, maybe. But Andrew also was from Bethsaida. He also had a track record and pattern of introducing and bringing people to Jesus, even more so than Philip. He's the one who introduced Peter to Jesus, which if you know anything about the Bible, that's a pretty big get that he pulled that one off. He's also, and this is where Philip and Andrew have this buddy comedy dynamic, when you go back where Jesus wants to feed the 5,000, he just says to his disciples, solve it. And Philip goes, and he counts his money, he goes, we do not have enough to buy these people lunch. Doesn't know what to do. Andrew, though, finds or brings that young boy with the fish and loaves and brings him to Jesus. So Andrew knows a little bit, or has a little more experience making those connections, and he also happens to have a Greek name, Andreas, which means man or manly. You might say dude. So Horseboy and the dude confer and approach Jesus. And Jesus answers. And I'm going to put that in scare quotes too, because it's a very Jesus-y answer. He never once in this passage directly engages the Greeks, by the way. And he doesn't really talk directly to Philip and Andrew. It's more like he's announcing something. So he answers. And here's what he says. Now remember, this has to be significant. It's been included. It's in the early part of this week. This energy and controversy and all these things are happening, and these Greeks just show up. And here's what starts to unfold. It says in verse 23, Jesus says, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And very truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." Are you following? I wouldn't. This makes no sense. This is really weird. He's talking about grains of wheat and agriculture. We got these Greeks just standing here, waiting for the number to be called. What is going on? Jesus keeps going. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. And he says, this will clear it up, those who love their life lose it, and those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Now he's doing riddles. What is going on? And then he says in verse 26, whoever serves me must follow me. And where I am, there will my servant be also. And whoever serves me, the Father will honor. And possibly, right there, their ears perk up. Whoever, just to quote Jesus, but really whoever. Like there must be some qualifications or things that we got to do beforehand for this whoever piece. But imagine, not only you're Philip and Andrew going, what's Jesus up to? And there's a pretty good track record at this point. They know it's probably going to be good, but they're not really sure. Those Greeks, likely close by, within earshot, they would perhaps latch on to that. And now, the Greeks might not be barbarians. Like, to be clear, they actually were the height of the known world civilization at that point that they were representing. So it's a little cheeky to use barbarians at this point. But nonetheless, they knew they were outsiders. They were not confused about that. They knew their status as they were approaching. So how would they know that? So let's push pause on Jesus' response. We're going to zoom out just for a moment. Because so far, kind of quickly, but it's given us some context, we've touched on the timing. This is the beginning part of this Holy Week, as we now call and celebrate it. This triumphal entry has happened, and on the heels of that energy and controversy and what's being stirred up, these Greeks show up. That's the timing. And we started to flesh out these characters and what might be represented or going on there. It's very unusual, not unknown, but a bit weird that Greeks are showing up. How Philip and Andrew and how God may have prepared them and given them experiences and a cultural backdrop that let them maybe make some connections. And then, of course, Jesus. But what about the setting, the actual physical location where this is happening? Does it matter? Is this just some disembodied, story like a fable, or just has a moral to it? Or is it really flesh and blood, literally down to earth, in a place that matters? Is the location telling part of the story? So here's something that'll help. We'll just do one piece at a time. This is the temple, the Jerusalem temple. This was Herod's temple in a sense, not because he's the one, Herod the Great, few generations before Jesus' time, did this massive building campaign to make this opulent version of the temple. And in that middle part is where it would be the Holy of Holies. If you know your Raiders of the Lost Ark or Bible, that's where the Ark of the Covenant would have been stored. At this point, though, in Jewish history, that's been lost. Joe Rogan says it might be in Ethiopia. We don't know. But at this point, it's gone. But only one person, the high priest, could enter that space, and only once a year after an unbelievably rigorous set of ritual cleansings and confessions and going through all. And if anything went wrong, he dropped dead. He's kind of captain of the team. But then we've got the starting varsity that they can come pretty close, and that's the priest's courtyard that's just outside. That's the next concentric circle of sacredness. And then on the bench, maybe JV, is the Israelites' courtyard, which is somewhat euphemistic for men, because the women's courtyard in this culture is, of course, outside that. But all of this is within this sacred space. So where are the Gentiles showing up? Where are these Greeks approaching and coming up? Well, they've got their own spot. They've got their own courtyard. It's big. It's out there. But how would they know they're outsiders? Well, there's also a wall called the Sorg, about 5 feet tall, made of stone. It's got some lattice work or something from the descriptions, and different historians of the day have talked about where they could see through, and there was openings. But that wall, they weren't supposed to cross. And again, how would they know it? Like, say they didn't have any backdrop or background, which they very likely did. They're not showing up randomly to worship. They've got some sense. Again, they're likely God-fearers. Well, there was helpful signs placed about every 10 to 20 feet. And we'll just pull up the first one here. For those who read Greek, don't get ahead of us. Let's make it a surprise for your neighbor. But there was these signs every 10 to 20 feet, both in Greek and Latin, so that anyone coming by could know what was going down. And here's what it said, just some helpful directions. No foreigner is to enter the barriers surrounding the sanctuary. He who is caught will have himself to blame for his death, which will follow. The Roman Empire actually gave the Jewish authorities the power of capital punishment, which was unheard of, because they knew how seriously the Jews took this. And they weren't going to get in the way of that. So let's zoom back in. Remember, I interrupted us, but Jesus is saying one arc here. And he continues in verse 27. And he says, now, my soul is troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No. It is for this very reason I came to this hour. Now is the time for judgment of this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out. And I, when I'm lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. There's the punchline. What's Jesus doing? What is he doing in this very moment, this intersection of these people, this place, this timing? What's he doing during that week as it unfolds? Or as the early church is then birthed and travels through the centuries, across the years, and continues today? What is Jesus doing in light of this here at Rock Harbor and in your life? Like your life, and your lives together. He is making room and destroying barriers so that not some, not a select few, not the special people, all, including the barbarians, including the cleaned up and all the rest, so that all may know him, may see him and receive that offer of renewal and redemption. In Jesus, he will cross the line that demands death, so no one else has to. And so in the other gospel accounts, and John references it and places it in a different place, but in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all four gospels talk about this next event. And Mark, Matthew, and Luke place it clearly in this moment of the temple cleansing. And so we'll look at Mark's account, Mark 11. So somewhere on the heels of what he has just spoken in this event with the Greeks, this then takes place. But Mark just gives it, it says, on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts, which are clearly, with very little wiggle room, this courtyard of the Gentiles, from the context and other things. He entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. You know the story, he flips the tables, he kicks over the benches, he makes a whip, and drives out the animals, including the livestock, that kind of thing. And in the midst of it, as he's doing this, he's teaching. We jump ahead and he says, as he was teaching, as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations?" This is an epic response that Mark captures to this exchange with the Greeks, is how I read it, where Jesus is reclaiming that space. Because the circles don't get smaller for sacredness. They extend everywhere through Jesus. And it's for his holy purpose he restored that, to create space for those far away to draw near. But you still have that literal Soreg wall with a death sentence. More profoundly, more importantly, more personally, that insurmountable set of walls, spiritual and human barriers of Satan, sin, death. Here's how the Apostle Paul then applies this on the other side of the crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 13, he says, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one, the religious insider and the irreligious outsider, broadly speaking. He has made one and has destroyed the barrier." Paul is clearly referencing this Soreg wall, amongst other barriers. And then almost as a continuous thought, if we just jumped over to Colossians 3, Paul spells it out even further in case you're like wondering, there's these two categories, but do I fit in? Or do we really include those people? He gives some more detail. In Colossians 3:11, he says, "And in that renewal, there is no longer Greek and Jew, nor circumcised and uncircumcised." So the Greeks don't have to become Jews before they follow Jesus. There's also not, we got standards though. We want people who are civilized. Well, there's barbarians included. But at some point, we've got to draw the line. No, there's Scythians. They're the people that scared the barbarians. So for those who grew up in the South, you might think of anyone north of the Mason-Dixon line a certain way. And I know there's lots of transplants here, so you've experienced it. And then there's, once you get up there, there's like New England is a thing. And then in New England, it's like, yeah, but those northern states, Vermont, New Hampshire, live free or die. Maine, they don't even bother with a statement because they don't care. But in Maine itself, where I grew up at the top, the very top is just called the county. That's not scary, right? Stephen King, the horror author, he hopped on 95, got as far as Bangor and stopped because the county was the next thing. He says, this is far enough for me. I come from Scythians. That's my background. Nor slave and free. All of the ethnic, religious, cultural, and social divisions are wiped out in Jesus. In case someone's looking for a loophole, Paul clears up in Galatians 2 where he says male and female, everybody. There's no separate courtyard anymore. So Jesus doesn't just risk a potential barbarian church. He invites it. I know it because of how he invited me. And I don't have time to do the whole story, but it makes zero sense. And I'm a follower of Jesus, let alone planted 3 churches, directly oversaw, it's in the 60s, where I was the director of church planting, for men and women, East Coast and now across Canada. And for some of you, I wonder how this hits as well. You see, Jesus invites you and me across all those barriers. He wants a barbarian church. And if we're gonna throw this on a t-shirt, have a little tagline, if we're doing Barbarian Covenant Church, which I would sign those papers in a heartbeat as a director of church planting, a church for barbarians by barbarians. And then, because you gotta put it in there, little parentheses, and everyone else, but really mostly barbarians. So how might that apply? Let me start as we're kind of landing here. Great way to put it together. Let me start while we're finishing. Very preacher weasel words there. But as we're bringing it down, for those who consider themselves followers of Jesus, whether you think you do it great or terrible, you got it all figured out, or just can't pull it off, for those followers of Jesus here at Rock Harbor, the encouragement for you, and possibly the challenge, is to follow Philip's example and to be willing to be approachable for those seeking Jesus, even if you're a bit unsure or hesitant on what the follow-through looks like. Yet so connected in Christian community that you at least know a guy, you've got a gal that you can tag in to bring their gifts to bear. Or perhaps it's an Andrew-style calling that you need to step up with that extra dose of risk-taking, with some problem-solving where you exhibit some leadership. And maybe it's a bit of a Sunday school answer, but it's Jesus. And so you don't have a lot to figure out. You just know, get them to Jesus. He'll take care of it. Or like Jesus. You may think that's a pretty high calling. Yeah, it's also the one he tells us to do, to be like him. Will you make space? Will you cross barriers? Even if it means clearing out religious clutter in your life or in your church community, to be willing to be a bit uncivilized, to clear some tables, pick some things over if they're truly taking up space that is meant for others to approach Jesus. And whether that's in your life directly or here in this church. And to be clear, I'm not being kind of cleverly, like these are principles to apply. This is super practical. Jesus kicked people out of the Gentile courtyard because they were taking up room and ruining the space for those people. So literally, to have a sunrise service, or 8:30, they call it here, and 2 service, so there's more room, to think about how you use this physical space and other opportunities that are on deck, and to be very careful to not then fill them with religious paraphernalia, but to use them as a ministry tool. Are you willing to do that? And here's a subtext that if I was too subtle throughout this message, let me make it very clear. For those, again, and we'll get to my favorite people in a moment, because those are my people, at least where I come from. But you people, no offense intended, but you guys, don't let yourself get too civilized. Don't smooth out the wild, messy call of Jesus with performative religion or some facade. Keep it real. Because you know who's best at reaching barbarians? Other barbarians who've been redeemed. Put that in there. And don't clean yourself up too much, because not only might others not recognize Christ in you because that's been clouded and hidden, but hear this more subtle danger. I think this is as dangerous and as harmful. They won't recognize themselves in you, and will miss the opportunity to see what someone at all like them actually looks like in a life with Jesus. And so in the coming weeks, as we enter in the church calendar, Lent preparation towards the Holy Week, is a great opportunity for you who follow Jesus to act like Philip, to act like Andrew, to act like Jesus and pray and invite and look for those opportunities. In our cultural calendar, in aligning with the Christian calendar, there's rarely a better time literally in the year than that Easter season where those who are curious and cautious are willing to come a little closer and say, very politely usually, "Sir, ma'am?" And now for the others of you in the room. You've been prayed into this room, whether you know it or not as well, and invited and welcomed. You've already come this close. And I'll say this, whatever reason you're here, even if it's because you're just being polite, the person that invited you, you still showed up. But for others, I suspect, even if you don't really believe Jesus is real or true, man, would you still love to see him? Just know you're invited as well. And if, like those Greeks, you feel like you're an outsider because you think you've read a sign, and maybe sadly you did read one, it just wasn't one Jesus put there, there's a reason for you to be here. Something in you, I trust, genuinely wants to see Jesus. And so if your approach and posture this morning, and I remember what this was like for me, of being cautious and curious, being doubtful, for me it was a very intellectual exercise. For others, it may have more emotional connection or relational. There's all the different ways. It had to make sense for me. If your approach and posture, doubtful or hopeful, is that I wish to see Jesus, I'd say just let that be your prayer. And if it's helpful, while the band plays, there's the invitation where prayer team folks, I'll hang up front. If a conversation, you don't have to go directly to Jesus. You can come to a Philip or an Andrew. Name some women too in the New Testament, Priscilla, Prisca, Junia, others. They'd be happy to make the connection. So you're invited to do that. Across those barriers that Jesus has torn down, there's space for you. Amen? Amen.